Before I finish up with the autotrophic protistans, I wanted to update what I was telling you about malaria. On an earlier slide, I had the 2009 statistics for how many deaths from malaria, and it was more than 1 million people. In 2018, about 450,000 people died of malaria. That's still a lot of people, but that is a huge improvement. There's also been a really big improvement in mortality from HIV/AIDS. So HIV/AIDS in 2009 killed about 2 million people. But in 2019, just a decade later, that year, only about 700,000 people have died. Right now, it's the end of October in 2020. And at the end of 2020, which has been a terrible year, there's been more than 2 million people who have died of COVID-19. So we get a handle on malaria and HIV, and boom, COVID-19. So let's talk about diatoms. Diatoms are nothing but lovely, everything lovely about them. Now, we're talking about autotrophic protistans. So these are autotrophs, and they are protistan. And in just common language, autotrophic protistans are very often just called algae. Right? Algae can be small or it can be big. These guys are single cells. They're single cells. And yet, look at what they do. This is colorized light microscopy, scanning light microscopy. And what we see is that these guys called diatoms, they make an external wall for themselves that is made out of glass. There are people who study, how do they make glass? But they do, it is made out of glass. And when they make it out of glass, it's not just like, I don't know, smooth glass. Look at these remarkable, intricate designs that you can see when you look at them through light microscopy. This blows my mind. That is a single-celled organism. That's nutty, right? So beautiful. Now, why do they make them out of glass? Glass does help protect them when they're eaten, but the stuff that humpback whales eat, you know, they suck in all of the algae stuff. Most of it is made out of these guys, and it's not protecting them. It also helps them to not be so light, so it gives them ballast so that they don't get flopped around in the water as often. Really beautiful. So if I ask you, what is the protistan that has a wall made out of glass, you will tell me diatoms. And they come in remarkable shapes. Look, this is something like a fancy triangle. This one always reminds me of the Eiffel Tower for some reason. I just think it looks like the Eiffel Tower. Really complicated structures. If you were in a lab and we were looking at it through your light microscope, this is what yours might look like, because we're just using light and we're not using the fancier electron techniques. But still, really remarkable. Diatoms also make 1/4 of the oxygen on Earth. You now know that the process of photosynthesis, largely by plants, but also by algae, is what makes the oxygen that we breathe here on Earth. It is a waste product for the plant, but for us, it's what we need. And out of all of the oxygen on Earth that's here, 1/4 of it, 25%, was made by diatoms. Diatoms are also very, very important for the carbon cycle. And one of the reasons we study diatoms is to see if we can steal carbon out of the atmosphere by somehow encouraging the growth of diatoms, and that might help us with global warming. Now, we're going to go on to the macroscopic protistans, protistans that you do not need a microscope to see, and they're called seaweeds, right? Seaweeds and other algae that you can like point at when you're looking in the water, they are not plants. They do belong to the category of the protistans. They're just really, really big. So this is a picture of brown algae. I know in this slide it looks a little bit green, but brown algae actually uses a brown photopigment for its photosynthesis. And these guys are not plants, okay? There are water plants like water lilies and stuff like that, but these are not water plants. They actually are protistans, and they are remarkable. If we were to look at some of our own giant kelp, the coastline of California is special in the sense that it has enormous forests of this protistan called giant kelp. So you can see how tall it gets. Now, these forests, they're not stable forests, meaning that a plant like this that you see here one year is not necessarily going to be there again. But the forests themselves are constantly there. And the giant kelp is different because they use a different photosynthetic pigment than plants do. And that's why it's brown kelp, our giant kelp. So it's not a plant. On top of that, it does look very plant-like, but do you remember when we were talking about convergent evolution? I have no idea why I just did that. Do you remember when we were talking about convergent evolution? And I told you that just because two things look alike, like the pangolin and the armadillo, does not mean they're related to each other. Pangolin and armadillo, totally different sides of the family tree of mammals. They look alike because there's a great set of solutions for living in that environmental niche. Well, the macroscopic protistans look like plants because they are photosynthetic and they're not in air, but they do have water going across them all the time. When we make solar energy harvesters, we make them in big flat panels that we attach to roofs, right? Solar panels. Well, I guess theoretically, you could be a tree that's a big flat panel. But what would happen? If you tried to stand up, the wind would quickly blow you over. And if you laid yourself flat on the ground, quickly dirt would cover you up. So that is not a good solution from the point of view of a plant or from the point of view of a seaweed. What is a good solution are leaves. But since this is not a plant, we do not call these leaves. We call these blades. These things that look like leaves are actually called blades. This is, so leaf, not a leaf. The stipe is not a stem. It looks like it, but a stem, you will learn, has got vascularity inside of it. And these are stipes. They do not have vascularity inside of this. And these are not roots. They're not roots. Roots go into the soil generally to gather up moisture, water, to give to the plant. This is a water plant. It does not need roots. It's surrounded by water. So these are holdfasts. They're just there to keep the plant in place, the algae in place. And plants do not have floats because they do stand up in the air. They don't float in the air. But the floats on our giant kelp actually make make the algae buoyant in the water current. And they are filled with air to make them buoyant. Now, there are other kinds of seaweed, lots and lots of kinds of seaweed. Some kinds of seaweed are really, really hard. They've got a lot of calcium in them. And we think that is so that some of them, so they can resist the action of waves. So this is an area where waves hit against the rocks sometimes. Sometimes it's covered with water, and sometimes it's left to dry out. So this has got a hard stuff in it to allow this kind of algae to survive all of that. There also is a kind of coralline algae that is just crunchier, just to make fish and turtles in the sea kind of not like it very much. So it's not very delicious. So it's a little more likely to reproduce. And here we have another one that you will see pictures of. Make sure you know these things about this guy who is also something that you can see easily. Sometimes when there's pond scum on a pond, it is actually a lot of Spirogyra, not all the time. But this is Spirogyra, okay? A spiral is a spring shape. And look at this spring shape here, this spring shape going up the inside of that particular cell. Spirogyra got its name because of that spiral appearance. And Spirogyra, those green spirals, are chloroplasts. So if we ask you, what are those green spirals? You will say that they are chloroplasts. Heck, they're green. Anything green has got chlorophyll in it and is used for photosynthesis. There is a type of seaweed that gets known as sea lettuce, and people argue over whether it should be considered a protistan or if it should be considered a plant. I'm not going to get into it. Whether you consider it a protistan or not, it definitely is the closest seaweed relative to our own land plants, right? So bacteria, protists, that's what we're looking at today. Know how they're related, Linnaean organization. Oh, one last thing I wanted to show you. Red tides. Red tides actually can kill a lot of sea life. There recently was a big die-off of, I think, dolphins or something like that they attributed to red tides. But red tides are actually very pretty, particularly on a moonless night. So if you would like to see a really good video of red tide bioluminescence down in San Diego, this is a nice YouTube video to watch. Or if you ever hear that there's going to be a red tide off our coast, if it's going to be a moonless night, or if you can go out when the moon's not out yet, it's really beautiful to see, because these algae that we're talking about, some of them, the ones that do a red tide, when you tumble them, they spark light, kind of like a glow bug. So, all right, that's it. We'll see you next week.